Hi, LifeGroup leaders. My name is Sean Murphy, and I get the opportunity to share with you some insights concerning the upcoming lesson for session 10 out of this quarter's study, where we begin a study into 2 Thessalonians. It's entitled Enduring, and it'll be found on page 84 and following in your quarterly. Since we're changing letters at this point, I want to take a little opportunity to give you some background on 2 Thessalonians. Most commentaries say that it was written maybe months after 1 Thessalonians, so that there's a lot of similarities in what he's speaking of. Unlike 1 Thessalonians, Paul doesn't spend any time speaking or defending himself in this letter. 2 Thessalonians is written strictly to address needs and points of emphasis in the Thessalonian church. He does revisit some of the same issues and some of the same touch points. There's a great deal of encouragement for the church at the beginning. He also speaks concerning end times during this letter. I'd like to break the letter down into like three major portions, and they're all based on the chapters. Chapter 1, once you get past the introduction and greeting, is concerning encouraging the church during persecution. Part 2, you'll find in chapter 2, is dealing with teachings on end times. And the third and final chapter covers the idea of living an active life. Paul brings all those three into this letter, and those will be the major breakdowns in the letter itself. Our lesson will cover the bulk of chapter 1 from verses 3 through 12. In that passage of Scripture, there are three other areas that we're going to address today. Verses 3 and 4 are a commendation to the church. Paul looks at the church of Thessalonica, and the two main things that he sees as major points of emphasis as encouragement to them is their faith, their growing faith in God, even in the midst of persecution, as well as their growing love for one another. Now, verse 3, he says, we ought to thank God. Now, where I'm from, when you say we ought to do something or I ought to do something, there's a little bit more obligation to it. We don't necessarily see that as a very positive thing. It's something I have to do. Paul's not saying it that way. What Paul's saying is, I get to thank God for you. I look forward to thanking God for you because it's a duty that I enjoy, thanking God for you and what I see him doing in and through you. You know, you wonder, why is Paul putting the emphasis on thanking God instead of emphasizing the idea of praising the congregation? Let's face it, we're all human. They were human too. We all have tendencies to make idols out of things. We tend to become proud and puffed up over our achievements. The spiritual growth that Paul's witnessing in the life of this church is not their doing. It's what God is doing in and through them, and he wants to make sure that the credit goes where the credit belongs. The areas Paul points out in their faithfulness to God in the midst of tribulation and in their love one for the other sounds a lot like what Jesus points out as the greatest commandments in Matthew. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Their ability to stand firm in their faith, even in the face of persecution, was evidence of their vital, growing relationship with God. But now, wait a minute. The Great Commandment says to love the Lord your God. It doesn't say faith. Fair enough. Show me someone who stands firm in their faith during the tough times of life, and I'll show you someone who loves the Lord, their God, with everything they have. Coupling that with their growing faith, with their ability to love one another and their increasing love for one another. It was had such an impact on Paul that Paul was using them somewhat as an example to other churches. He was boasting on them, according to verse 4, to other churches. Now, he wasn't using them as a means of shaming the other churches. I believe Paul was using them as an opportunity to disciple these other churches. This is what it looks like to love God and to love one another. You know, we could learn a lot more from one another if we would simply take the time to observe one another and stop comparing ourselves to one another. The second section we're going to look at is verses 5 through 10. It's a big section. The big point of emphasis that jumped off the page to me is Paul spends a lot of time reminding them early in this section of what the end game is. You know, the end game was not to necessarily get away from the persecution. The end game was to be found worthy of God's kingdom as a result of facing this persecution. You know, it's easier to press on towards the goal if we're reminded from time to time that there is actually a goal. It doesn't feel like futility. It doesn't feel hopeless when we know there's an end in sight. When we know that there is a reason for this happening. You know, races have finish lines, and do-it-yourself projects have finishing touches. Well, the spiritual journey has a goal as well, and that's to arrive on the other side of eternity and hear these words spoken by God himself. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Not only does Paul remind them of the end game, but he spells out how God's justice will be served in the final assessment. See, God will prove his omnipotent justice by extending relief to the afflicted, and to those who have caused the affliction, they will reap the full measure of God's justice. See, the affliction and mistreatment we often experience, it's not focused on us. We like to personalize it, but it's not really. They're not attacking us. They're attacking the God we serve, the God we try to follow. Mainly it's focused on God because they deny God and his free gift of the gospel. And so they do everything they can to devalue it. As much as we would like to think we can even the score in our own flesh, God is much more capable, and his just vengeance will have its far greater impact. Paul's given the Thessalonian church, as well as us today, a glimpse at the end of the book and letting us see that God is far better at dispensing righteous justice than we are at devising some kind of personal means of exacting revenge. And we see all that in verses 5 through 10. In verses 11 and 12, Paul is taking them and showing them how he prays for them. What his specific prayer request for them is. Encouraging them to press on in the manner in which they are now living. He reminds them of who is actually doing the real heavy lifting in this transformational life that they are living. and calling them to be found worthy of the calling of God. He also draws their attention to the reality that all this is happening in and through them so that God can be glorified. See, our lives are supposed to be continuous acts of worship. Not every moment is a circumstance that would be categorized as a mountaintop experience or a mountaintop moment. There are tough times in life. There are disappointments in life. But our life still has a responsibility to be lived in such a manner that it brings glory and honor to God. And Paul stresses that to them. A great hymn writer, Horatio Spafford, he penned it this way: "Whatever my lot, thou, God, hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." May our souls find rest in Him, regardless of the unrest and turmoil that surrounds us. Then we can live a life that glorifies God, and others will see it. And God can use our lives, even in the tough times, to draw others to Him. Those are some of the things that kind of jumped off the page to me when I was studying this lesson. And those are some things we're going to spend some time addressing in our class. Perhaps they'll be helpful to you as you begin to prepare and study for yours as well. Pray that God would use your time of study to draw you closer to Him and give you more than enough to bring to your class as we all grow through this study of Thessalonians. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you Sunday. Have a great day.